More than 3,000 delegates are attending the annual meetings of the African Development Bank in Kigali, Rwanda. The three-day conference started on Wednesday and it ends today. Some of the issues that are up for discussion are new strategies to tackle poverty, underdevelopment, and put their weight behind global negotiations to ensure the continent enters a new era. Well, here to elaborate a little bit more on the AFDB meetings is Dr. Babatunde Omilola, who is an economist with the UNDP. It's good to have you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk about the primary work of the African Development Bank here on the continent.
African Development Bank has been on the continent for the last 50 years, and what it does is to support development across Africa. So it funds development, it looks at issues of poverty reduction strategies, it also looks at how to actually ensure economic growth on the African continent. But for us at the United Nations Development Program, we work closely with the African Development Bank and the Organization for Economic Development. And what we have done with them is that we have actually produced a report which is called the African Economic Outlook for 2014. And this report is being launched at the annual meetings of the African Development Bank in Kigali, Rwanda.
Okay. In terms of the theme, it's the next 50 years, the Africa we want. If we had to give them a sort of a scorecard and we had to look at their work over the past 50 years, how have they done? Has their work been successful on the continent?
I think African Development Bank has done very well. It has actually recorded a lot of successes since its creation 50 years ago. And you will know that when African Development Bank was created, the headquarters was in Abidjan for a very long time, until the crisis in Abidjan made it to relocate temporarily to Tunisia. So overall, I think African Development Bank has funded infrastructure development in Africa. It has supported poverty reduction strategies. It has also looked at ways where economic growth can be inclusive on the African continent. And that's exactly what we have been trying to do with them, to actually look at how to integrate Africa into global value chains, and also how to industrialize Africa very quickly, and how to sustainably reduce poverty on the African continent and bring together all the marginalized people across the continent so that they can also benefit from the rapid economic growth process that is currently underway in Africa.
Looking forward, do you think that their tactics are going to change, or do they still have to address the problems that have been there for the last 50 years? I mean, that's a reality, unfortunately.
The reality is, at least, if you look at the last 20 years or even the last decade, most people talked about Africa as a dark continent or the scar on the conscience of the world. But what you have seen is that in the last 10 years, there has been massive and rapid economic growth on the African continent, which means we have actually turned the tide in Africa. 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are currently in Africa. So I think for African Development Bank to continue to contribute to development in Africa, we'd have to look at ways whereby inclusive growth can be generated on the African continent. And by that inclusive growth, there are 3 dimensions to that. It means that the current growth trajectory on the African continent must be sustained for a long period of time, and it must also be able to cut across broad-based economic sectors and also provide employment opportunities for a majority of Africans. And I think this is the direction the African Development Bank should pursue.
The African Development Bank also, I suppose, coming under the spotlight where many are feeling that they need to support entrepreneurship more, and that's one of the biggest problems on the African continent, is that some countries just do not support entrepreneurs. They're also calling on the bank to be bold and flexible in supporting the private sector as well. Some countries are good at it, and yet other countries aren't. I mean, I can bring up South Africa as an example for, the lack of support for entrepreneurs. If you speak to many, that's how they feel. Your view on this? I mean, is that a focus area for them?
Yes, it is a very good focus area, not only for the African Development Bank, but for all the organizations working on development in Africa. And I think we have to actually look at roles and responsibilities of the private sector as well as the public sector in Africa. The public sector is expected to actually provide conducive environment for the private sector to thrive. In the case of South Africa, what we have seen from UNDP side is that at every point in time in South Africa's economy, there are about 5 million SMEs, small and medium enterprises. But unfortunately, 60% of them die before they reach 18-month maturity. So I think not only for Africa, But for the entire, I mean, not only for South Africa, but the entire African continent, we have to look at ways of reducing unemployment rate. Unemployment rate is one of the biggest issues, and entrepreneurship can be a way of doing that. We also have to harness the demographic dividends on the African continent. If you look at South Africa, just this first quarter alone, unemployment rate stood at around 25.2%, which is extremely high. But if you also look at many other African countries, the same is also the case. And not only unemployment rate, but also an issue of inequality. As I said earlier on, 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. At the same time, 7 of the 10 most unequal countries in the world are also in Africa. So unemployment, inequality, and poverty are the triple challenges that have to be confronted. And that is exactly what we do. At UNDP, we have what we call the Supply Development Program. Yeah. Through that program, we try to match SMEs with suppliers and big companies so that at the end of the day, they will have opportunities to understand what is going on in the market area, and entrepreneurship can actually be pursued diligently and effectively.
I have to ask you one more question, and very, very quickly, I need a quick answer on this one. Nigeria, I think one of the big stories this year was that Nigeria overtook South Africa as the largest economy on the continent now. However, a lot of the residents and the citizens of Nigeria feel that, you know, it means nothing to their lives because they're still not reaping the benefits of being so-called the biggest economy within the continent. What's the problem? Why is it that economy of an African country can be so big and yet the people do not benefit from this? That I think there's something in between there that's not right.
Oh, thank you for asking that question. And apparently I'm a Nigerian myself, even though I work in South Africa.
You're an expert on this. You're an expert on this.
Yes. I think
a quick analysis.
The rebasing of the Nigeria's GDP was long overdue, you know, because the last base that was used for it was in 1990. So 23 years after that, I think it was long overdue. And I think it's a very good field effect that Nigeria now has the largest economy on the African continent. But the challenge is that has not translated into poverty reduction. Yeah. It has also not translated into GDP per capita, which is really low. Infrastructure development is also very weak in Nigeria. So there are a lot of challenges, and most of these challenges have been there for a very long period of time. Security is also another challenge. We have heard of the activities of Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, particularly in the northeastern part of Nigeria. So most of these challenges are there. But I think if you look at Nigeria, you will see despite all these challenges, Nigeria has emerged as the largest economy on the African continent. So it means that if Nigerian leaders are able to harness demographic dividends in Nigeria and are able to ensure that GDP growth, which is around 7% rate for the last 3-4 years in Nigeria, is inclusive enough, so that most people that are not benefiting or that are not participating from the growth process in Nigeria can get into the mainstream of Nigeria's development agenda. Maybe Nigeria will achieve. But overall, I think Nigeria needs to invest massively in energy. Electricity consumption in Nigeria is extremely low, and I think that is where Nigeria needs to actually learn from South Africa. All
right, thank you for joining us. Thank you for shedding some light on this issue for us. That was Dr. Babatunde Omilola informing us on on how Africa and the African continent will strive in the next 50 years.